Welcome to this webinar session. My name is Jane Gwynn Goodall, and I'm one of the co-chairs of this year's reunion. I will be the host and moderator for this session. Because this is a webinar, the viewing audience will be able to see our panel, but we will not be able to see the audience. Today's guests have agreed to take part in this panel to share their personal family stories. The questions have been pre-selected. We're often reminded of the numbers. 1,195 men sailed, 879 perished, 316 survived. None will be forgotten. Our guests each represent one of the 879 crew members who did not come home from that final sailing mission. Their relatives ranged in age from the youngest at 17 years old to the eldest at 42. 3 of the men were married and had children. All of them left legacies. Let me first introduce you to the crew, and then you'll have a chance to meet their families. This is where we share the screen. Keith Phillips is the grandson of Elvin Carey Malone, Seaman First Class from Guntown, Mississippi. Elvin was 22 years old at the time of the sinking. Joining Keith today in the room will be his mother, Ann Malone Link, who's Elvin's daughter. No. Joseph Ambrose Flynn, Commander Navigator from New Haven, Connecticut, was 42 years old at the time of the sinking. Commander Flynn is represented by his grandson, Paul Everts. Albert Rice, Stewart's Mate First Class from Kansas City, Kansas, was 20 years old at the time of the sinking. Seaman Rice is represented by his niece, Jeanette Pitts. Carol Lansing Gove, Seaman Second Class from Randolph, Wisconsin, was 21 years old at the time of the sinking. With us today is Seaman Gove's daughter, Judy Gove Robbins. And Charles Keith Neal, Seaman Second Class from Indianapolis, Indiana. Keith was 17 years old at the time of the sinking, and he is represented today by his niece, Nancy Bolt. Keith, why don't we start with you? Your grandfather was married and had a family. How old was your mother when the ship was sunk?
Well, I appreciate y'all having me today to do this. I really do. My mother was 1 year and 2 weeks old when the ship was sunk. The ship left port on the 16th of July, which was her birthday. And so she was just a baby.
Did he have other children, or was your mom his only child?
She was the only child, and so it was just her, my grandmother and my mother, and so yeah.
Can you share a little bit about him? What would you like us to know about him?
Well, if he was anything like the rest of his brothers, he was a nut. They all had a pretty good sense of humor, the ones that I met, and just a interesting bunch of folks, good people, and he was a good man. He was a Christian man. He was a born-again believer, a member of a church outside of Guntown, out in the country at the Friendship Community, and he was just a hard-working young guy coming up in those early years of the 30s and 40s, like so many others. I met a man last year at a nursing home where I do some ministry work at, and he told me about my grandfather driving a school bus to make money, and he rode the school bus with him and one other man one day into Baldwin, Mississippi, which was kind of a hub town where everybody shopped at, and he rode the bus with him that day, and what they were going for was so that my grandfather could get clothes to go in the Navy with, and just wanted a new suit of clothes to where to go to boot camp in. So neat story. May not mean much to too many people, what it does to me. He was my grandfather was one of 7 brothers and 1 sister, and we have a picture of 6 of those brothers all in the service at the same time.
So did your grandmother remarry?
She did. My grandmother, when my mother was 3, my grandmother remarried, and a good man, and they were married for over 68 years. And before he passed away in 2014, my grandmother lived another 3 years, and she passed away in January of 2017. And so yeah, she married a good man, and he was good to her. He was good to my mother, and he was good to all these kids. I have 1 brother and 2 sisters. With one of my sisters passed away last month, but there were 4 of us, and my grandfather, that my mother's stepdad, he was a good man, and he was good of all of us. So he took really good care of my grandmother, and they had a really good life together.
So was it them that told you about your connection to the USS Indianapolis, or how did you learn about your connection to the USS Indianapolis?
There was never a lot of talk within the family about this. I guess a lot of families were kind of quiet, and ours was. As long as I can remember, my mother always told me about her father being on the USS Indianapolis. And matter of fact, when we were kids and the movie Jaws came out, we didn't watch Jaws, and when it started coming on TV, we didn't watch Jaws. And she would always have something to say about that movie and sharks and her daddy, and so she just we weren't allowed to watch Jaws. But yeah, she told us from when I was young. She has a trunk that has a lot of things in it, and we have a few pictures and letters and his medals and things like that. We also have in that trunk the dress my grandmother wore when they were married, and as well as a pair of pants and a shirt that we assume were his that he wore. And but my mother would show me these things when I was a little boy, and I just remember just being just taken with this stuff, and just I don't know, it just always sort of had a hold of me. And so through the years we learned a little more. My mother lived away from the rest of the family for a number of years, so you sort of lose contact with people. But back when Doug Stanton wrote his book, he was writing for a magazine back then that I was subscribed to, and I received his magazine one day and saw this article about the ship, and so that just really began for me, and that was in about 2000, 2001, somewhere in there. And that really, for me, began my search for information, and little by little learned more and more. I've read several books. I have a stack of some of them right here, and just where I've wanted knowledge about this. And after my mother's stepdad passed away, I was able to talk to my grandmother more about my grandfather and things like that. But in 2017, I came across a Facebook post where there was a parade going to be held in Jasper, Tennessee, near Chattanooga, and they were going to honor some of the men. Sorry.
Hey, it's okay. It happens to all of us. And that's the thing about this story. There's such an emotional connection to it. You never even know when it's going to come out of you. You can plan and prepare, and sometimes just a memory will get in your head. It happens to me, and because I know how much the men all meant to my dad, and I just think about that and I tear up. So it's okay.
Well, they were going to honor, I think 4 or 5 men that were on the Indianapolis that were all from the county over there where Jasper is. And I saw this, and it was the first time I had ever seen anything like that. And so I just started making phone calls, and I called Jasper, Tennessee City Hall, and everybody knew everybody there. And so they started putting me in contact with people. And before long, I was talking to Becky Dalrymple, and her uncle was one of the men that was on the ship. And you know, a few phone calls and some emailed pictures back and forth. And the next thing I know, 2 weeks later, I guess it was, we were in Jasper with my grandfather's name and picture on the side of a car that my mother rode in this parade that they were having for Veterans Day. And we all got to walk behind the car and in this parade, and it's a big deal. About 20 of my family members drove over there, and about a 4 or 5 hour trip for us. And about 20 members of the family drove over there on Saturday morning for this big deal. We all got together and ate breakfast before it at a Cracker Barrel in a little town just outside of Jasper. And we all had on shirts. And somebody, we don't know who it was, somebody bought our breakfast. And all of us, about 20 of us, and never knew who did that, but it meant a whole lot. Maybe they're watching this.
It's special to find that connection, very special, and then to know that your family member is appreciated by others. Paul, what about you? Your grandfather was one of the older members of the crew, at 42 years old. He was an officer and the navigator on the ship. Can you share a little bit about your family story?
I would like to echo Keith's thank you very much. I'm honored to be representing my family, and I'm humbled. I'm very humbled. And I hope I can keep it together. So my grandfather graduated from the Naval Academy in 1927. He was actually at the University of Minnesota at the NROTC as the professor. He goes back into duty, and he is assigned to the USS Indianapolis. He had 2 daughters. That would be my aunt and my mom. My aunt was 14 years old when the ship was sunk, and my mom was 6. So as far as the other family members go, like brothers and siblings, not much known. I do know that the other part of the question is, how was your family impacted? Hard, very hard. We didn't do parades. My mom, my aunt never talked about it. Never. It was almost forebode. We are not going to talk about it. And so it's very hard to sit here and know that we missed a lot. We missed a lot. And that, I think that's going to be maybe something that we have a tie to with other people. It was forebode. When Officer and a Gentleman came out, I was all excited. I was going to join the Navy. I said, yes, let's go, man. I want to carry the girl out. No. So we just didn't talk about it. So that it impacted the family great. My dear grandmother, they lived on Mare Island. Obviously, they were in the officers' quarters. They were treated with royalty. Back in the 40s, when you were an officer, you had a cook. You had a cleaner, you were treated, and then 6 months afterwards, you're gone. And it was rough upbringing for the 2 girls, my aunt and my mom. So it was pretty bad. I mean, I still have the letter that Captain McVeigh sent. Again, it was my grandfather being the executive officer. There is lots of pain. He dies on the ship. The captain doesn't die on the ship. And that was very hard on the family.
So what was the turning point for you? How did you get connected to the story?
Okay, so I believe in Jesus Christ. He's my Lord and Savior. I had a great job in Lodi, California. I decided, let's go back to Monterey. I grew up in Monterey. The reason why we grew up in Monterey is because my great uncle, who was a friend of my grandfather, was a rear admiral in the Navy. He taught at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. So that became our anchor hold. So we moved from Lodi, and the song is true, stuck in Lodi. And we moved to Monterey for whatever reason. And I was in the Monterey Peninsula College parking lot, 1994. And there was a yellow truck. And I was behind the yellow truck, and there's a license plate frame, USS Indianapolis Survivor. What the heck? So I get out of my car, knock on the old man's window. He rolls it down. And I said, is this truck yours? And he goes, yes. I said, is that license plate you? Yes. And again, I'm 29, so I'm excited now. I'm very excited. And I said, I am Commander Joseph Ambrose Flynn's grandson. And he gets out of the car and he hugs me and he says, I am Grover Carver. I was the driver for your grandfather at Mare Island. And I just praise God. There was a reason to go. And then Grover said, Paul, would you please come to the 50th reunion? I go home, tell mom and my aunt. I said how excited I was. Told them the story. Nothing.
Were they angry with you? Did they forbid you from going? I mean,
they did not want. Okay, good question. They did not want me to go.
Okay.
They wanted nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
And I had to talk my way into it, saying, this is not for me. This is for the men that are alive. This is for the ship. If you don't want to go, I have to respect that. On the other hand, I'm the only grandson. He only had 3 grandchildren, me and my 2 sisters, Jenny and Susie. That was it. So I said to mom and my aunt, and I convinced them to go. Our church did a fundraiser because at that time, when you're a high school band director, you don't have much money. You can't just go. So I went, and that was a turning point in my life. You go up to the microphone. Hello, good evening. My name is Paul Everts, and standing ovation. And then they started coming up one by one. All these men come up telling me these stories, and they told me how my grandfather died, and that was the ship's doctor at the time. I go home all excited. Nope. Don't even talk to me about it. It's okay.
Did they ever reach a point where they wanted to talk about it?
They did. They finally, and I said, it's a heroic story. I mean, let me just tell you the story. He does not get eaten by sharks. He doesn't die. I mean, he dies valiantly. He goes down to the hull of the ship and he commands them to close the hull of the ship, and he dies on the ship. So, that was 50 years late, 50 years too late. There was my aunt never got married. It was a bad deal for them. I would be the one of the 5 of us to say it was not very good. So, well,
let's find out about that if you're only one of the 5.
I know.
We'll come back to you. We'll come back to all of you. Jeanette, your uncle was one of several African Americans sailors on the ship. What do you know of his experience in the Navy, and what do you want others to know?
This meeting is being recorded.
Sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay. First of all, thank you, as others have expressed. Thank you for the opportunity to share and for honoring our loved ones. My uncle voluntarily enlisted, and my father, was my father's brother. My father spoke of how he talked about his plans to go into the military. In part, that could have been influenced because his uncle, my grandmother's brother, had served overseas in World War I, and for other reasons. But I know that he was very proud to serve. That was evident. He came home on furlough. But I also do know that evidently something had happened where he had experienced some of the horrors of war, because in his very last letter to home, he put some specific sentences in there to my father, expressing his desire that while he was proud to serve, that he hoped that my father would not have to ever go to war. I know a lot more about him actually personally. I don't know the details of what he did there, but I'd like to think that the attributes that people have talked about in him probably reflect what he was like in the service. He was, by all accounts, very mature for his age. He had to grow up very quickly. He and his twin sister were 12 years old when their mother died, and there were a total of 5 siblings. So suddenly, even though a family member took them all in, they were serving as really the guardians and the protectors, and he really watched over his siblings, paid particularly close attention to my father, guiding him and really helping him to grow to know how to be a young man. He was I'm told, a tremendous artist. He loved to sketch and to draw. And as I hear people talking about that, and as I think my nieces and nephews see my own father doing the same with the same skill set, I can just imagine him in his spare time, whether it was on a ship, just doing a little sketch. He was a tremendous athlete. And when I was, I think, late elementary school, early junior high school, my father was at an event and came across a state representative who commented on his classmate Albert and what an outstanding athlete he was, a very strong swimmer. They had grown up on the banks of the Kansas River, and as African Americans, they didn't have access to swimming pools, and so they swam in the river. That's what they learned. But even in that, he really paid close attention to my dad, protecting him, making sure that he didn't do things in an unsafe manner.
So, your father's brother, your father, is still living, and as you mentioned, they were close. So, how has Albert's legacy been shared in your family?
Well, I think the first aspect, and this kind of goes into what you were asking me in terms of what I would like people to know. One of the things that my father made very clear is obviously that African Americans did serve. And if you look in our history books, very early on, my father showed each of my siblings and me abandoned ship and gave us his copy of that. But there are no pictures that represent us in that and in other resources. So he made sure that we were aware, even though history didn't document that. But my father approached grief very differently, very realistically. And he just always talked about my uncle just like he talked about his other siblings, his uncles, his grandparents. And so we grew up knowing and feeling a certain intimacy towards him like we did with anyone else in our family. He wasn't just a history lesson for us. He was, in a sense, a living soul. And so even speaking of him as Albert, to me, sounds strange. His nickname was Bud, and we always referred to him as Uncle Bud. And I've always, throughout my life, referred, and just to say his name aloud seems disrespectful in our culture to do that. But I appreciate my father doing that for us so that we would all be aware and pass on that legacy of his.
So there is a legacy. And so what has been the generational impact of that legacy?
Well, I think a couple of things that, anytime you have a tragic event, and that's this and any other, there are ripple effects that go through generations. And so that can be on an individual basis. For example, with me, I'm a little claustrophobic. Both my siblings and I, we all have difficulty watching movies where people are trapped in water or in ships. We can't do that very easily. But on a broader scale, my father really approach things from a balanced standpoint, where he showed the pros and the cons of an event as a proud American, and he imparted that to us. Because of this legacy, we have not only the right, but the responsibility to do what we can to make sure that our country lives up to the ideals which it professes, which it actually has not always done, as we know. I think another way of sharing this is a post that my brother actually did about 7 years ago. And I'd just like to read you a few words from that. This was on Memorial Day. And he writes, speaking of my uncle, his memory is emblazoned on my mind, just as if I'd actually met him. But through the one extant photo, and more significantly, through my dad's superb memory and stories of Uncle Bud, my siblings and I feel like we know the uncle we never met. To you and to thousands of others like you, I say thank you, for you really did pay the ultimate sacrifice. To those who are unashamedly cynical and negative, I say even your right to the speech has been defended by those with whom you may most ardently disagree. Yes, it's been said before, freedom really isn't free. Thank you to Uncle Bud. He mentions my father who served in Korea, our cousins who served in Vietnam, and to thousands of other men and women who served and are now serving to help maintain that freedom. Eric Pitts, MD. And so the impact that we pass on to our generations on beyond us is that as proud Americans, we recognize this, we do what we do to protect, to defend, and to honor our country and each other.
Thank you for that. Absolutely. Let me move on to you, Judy. You were a little one. How old were you when your dad was lost at sea?
I was only 18 months old, so I don't remember him. I don't remember what he looked like, only from pictures. And I didn't go through all the shock to begin with, like my family must have gone through the shock and sadness. And about 8 or 9 years old is when I started realizing that I really didn't have a dad. We moved in with my grandparents, my mother and I did. So I didn't realize what was happening, although I remembered, and I remember them telling me that George Gove, who was my father's dad, went all over trying to find what happened, because he was in the World War I and he wanted to know what happened to the ship. And all I remember is my family telling me they read the account in the newspapers of the captain not zigzagging. He didn't zigzag. He got court-martialed, and he must be guilty. And that's what I had remembered. And it wasn't until years later, when I grew up, had children of my own, how significant the ship was to World War II and all the different things that went on that I didn't realize before this.
Well, you have been one of the fortunate ones. We hear quite a bit from families of lost at sea who want to know what happened, but they also want to know if any of the shipmates knew their loved one. Even to this day, we still have people that want to know, hoping that they can find one of the living survivors that can help fill in some of the missing pieces in their life. But you were fortunate. You did meet somebody who knew your dad. And how did that happen?
Yes, I did. I didn't go to the reunion until the 50th reunion, which would have been 25 years ago. To the 50th reunion, my family, my husband and I and my mother and my aunt went. And they had a portion where people were showing their pictures of their dads and their loved ones. Do you know this one? Do you know that one? And you could get up on stage and actually ask. So I got up on stage and I thought, well, I'm letting myself in for a big failure here. Are you going to be willing to take that? You know, is it really, there's only 80 people here out of the 1,200 sailors, 80 of the sailors were there. Are you really going to find somebody? And I thought, well, I have to try. That's all I can do is try. So I got up and I asked if anybody knew a sailor from Randolph, Wisconsin that was on the ship. Well, it was just a few minutes after that, a young man came up to me and said, my father knew your dad. He wants to talk to you. So I was rushed off to the stage, and my people that I were with, didn't even know where I went, but I went to meet with Don McCall from Champaign, Illinois. And it was just unbelievable. He told me what had happened. He told me that it was around midnight when the ship got torpedoed. He told me that my dad went down below to sleep and he hid a pillow and blanket. This is Don did. And he stayed on deck and slept on deck because they were real close to the equator and it was really hot. And so that's how he lived. He figured my dad got from the impact of the ship that he died then. And I just couldn't believe that I finally found somebody after everybody was trying in the Gove family to find somebody. I finally found somebody that knew him. I was just unbelievable. I just could hardly believe it. And Don was excellent. He was a friend of mine. He passed away about 2 years ago. But he had been a friend of mine till then, just like he was to my dad. His whole family took me under their wing. It's just an experience I never thought I'd have in life, which I have. And I'm so grateful for it, that I actually found somebody that knew him.
You've had something else special happen to you too. There's a statue in Waterbury, Connecticut of Father Conway. And Father Conway was the Catholic priest on the ship and the chaplain that's remembered for bringing comfort and last rites to the shipmates in the water. Your father's dog tags are in the hand of that statue. Can you tell us how that came to be?
Well, once again, it was Don McCall. He suggested the association, the Survivors Association, wanted to have somebody on there that would represent the 879 men that went down with the ship. And Don McCall suggested my dad, that his name be on that. So my dad is out there in Waterbury, Connecticut, and his memory will live forever. I went out there in October of 2015 to actually see the statue. The statue was still in the city hall, and we got there about noon, and well, they were out for lunch at that time. So we walked down the street, my aunt and cousins, we walked down the street, get a bite to eat. And here comes a guy with two other veterans. You could tell they were veterans by what they wore. And I saw him going, "Are you Judy? Are you Judy?" Well, finally I said, "I'm Judy." And here it was Robert Dorr, the person that wrote up the articles, and he was helped the veterans, get the statue going. So it has been just unbelievable. He had written a part in there that if anybody asks you whose name is on that tag, you tell them it's a hero from Randolph, Wisconsin. So once again, my family and I were just elated with such an honor that came to us. It was just unbelievable.
Because your dad's name lives on. How about you, Nancy? Your uncle was one of the youngest members of the crew. He was 17 years old when the ship went down. And I understand that he had older brothers serving. Did that influence his decision to enlist?
Yes, as far as I know. My grandparents, I keep trying to choke, sorry. My grandparents were from Indianapolis, and they actually had 9 boys total, and 5 of the boys served in the war. The older boys had already joined up. I'm sorry, I'm getting ready to get a drink. The older boys had joined, and excuse me, my dad was about 18 months older than Keith. And they were, I think, pretty close to each other. And my dad, my understanding of it is, my dad never really talked about it, but my understanding is that my dad joined the Army shortly after he turned 18. And so Keith would have only been about 16 and a half at that time. But I think right after my dad joined up, Keith went out and joined the Merchant Marine because he didn't have to have his parents' signature to join the Merchant Marine. And he actually served there for 6 months. And then afterwards, he joined the Navy in February of 45. So I think that with all of his older brothers going, you know what I mean, he was wanting to go serve. But he was the only, my Uncle Keith was the only one that did not come back from the war.
So what kind of impact did that have in your family?
They didn't, like others have said, and I want to appreciate everybody else's story is really interesting. So I appreciate being here too and hearing everybody else's story, but they didn't really talk about it that much. My grandmother, I remember as a little girl hearing stories from my grandmother about Keith, being on the Indianapolis and seeing like pictures of the telegram that they got and the letter from Captain McVeigh and picture of all of the brothers that was in the newspaper. We grew up, I know when other people were talking about their first reunion, our first reunion was in 1995 as well. I live in the Indianapolis area, and we, in 1995, we they had local broadcast, local stations had stories about the dedication of the new monument on the canal in Indianapolis. And they had a story where you could donate money to help the survivors get to the reunion, help pay their way. And so I thought, well, that would be a good thing to do to honor my uncle. And so I called up about it, and I ended up talking to John Gramosiak, which some of you may know, and he was coordinating a lot of things in Indianapolis about the reunions. And he said, well, we ought to come to the reunion. And I thought, well, I thought it was just for survivors, so I didn't even think about going. And so he said, well, no, everybody, is welcome, lost at sea families, rescue crew families, that sort of thing. So anyway, in 1995, we went to the first reunion and saw the dedication of the monument. And all of the living brothers got to be there for the reunion. So that was kind of special. Yeah.
So, and have you in the family, does the family now come to the reunions? Do you keep coming to the reunions? What's been your experience with that?
Yes, we started, my husband and I started in 95, and we've pretty much gone to all the reunions. In a couple special things, in 2008, we heard Peter Wren speak, and he was one of the rescue crew from the USS Bassett. And he wrote a book called We Were There, and he talked about picking up the survivors, but then also picking up the bodies, having the recovery mission. And we always assumed, through the years, my dad always told me that my uncle was probably went down with the ship, because he was only 17. He was new on the ship. He just got on in San Francisco when they left, a few months before the mission. So, or the month of the mission. So anyway, we just always assumed that he was lost at sea, or that he went down on the ship. And so in 2008, when we bought Peter Wren's book, we actually found where the USS Doyle had picked up 11 bodies, 9 of which were identified, and my uncle was one of them. So actually we saw his name in the book, that his body was identified. He had a burial at sea, which was kind of a special thing to find out. And it listed the coordinates, the longitude and latitude of, where the burial was. And so that was just kind of a really special thing to find out. So that was in 2008. In 2014, a lot more of my cousins and everything got involved, and we actually had 29 members of my extended family came to the 2014 reunion. And it was all of the first cousins from all of the brothers. And so that was just like a family reunion and kind of a special thing. Yeah.
Do any of you have, she mentioned the coordinates, and it made me think particularly of you, Paul. I know that your son is in the Navy. I know that your son is in the Navy in an area near those coordinates. What does that do for you? How do you?
That is anxiety. He was supposed to come home starting yesterday. He has been at sea since April, and with the COVID-19, he was on the USS Sterett. He gets transferred to the USS Nimitz. And then my heart starts racing because the USS Nimitz is going to the South China Sea. And we got an email from him yesterday from Bahrain, and he's supposed to be coming home next week. So until he comes home, I will admit to the world that there is one anxious father and mother, because I don't want to relive another bad thing. And that would be a real gut-wrenching experience if something were to happen to him. But he's supposed to be coming home next Monday.
So with him deciding to do this as a career, and your mother, your aunt, and the way that they feel, how does that reconcile in your family?
Well, my mom and my aunt ended up being very proud of him. We had some private conversations, we being me and my mom and my aunt, about PJ's decision to go to the Navy. In the end, we all have, if we have children, we all know they're going to make that decision, and I'm going to support that decision. So he went to the University of Idaho, which I think if I understand correctly, USS Indianapolis has something to do with the USS Idaho. And we didn't know that. And here's a boy going to the USS Idaho, goes to the University of Idaho. It goes into the NROTC program and graduates as an ensign. So all these little connections to it's fascinating to me. But yeah, so he's supposed to come home next Monday, and I hope he does. You know, not to be dramatic, but yeah.
We all hope he does.
Yeah.
How about the rest of you?
Yeah, we're really proud of him. So yeah.
And you should be. How about the rest of you? Do any of you have sons, daughters in the military? Cousins? Any?
I have well, I served in the Navy, and then my youngest son, he seems to have a desire to serve in the Navy as well. He talks about that just about every day that passes by, and he talks a lot about maybe becoming a Navy corpsman, and then he wants to go even further. And right now he plans to be a Navy SEAL if he can get through that. That's a big undertaking. But anyway, you were talking about knowing the coordinates to where he was buried at sea. We have a letter from Luther Doyle Polk that he sent to my grandmother, and he said that he was on watch with my grandfather when the ship was hit and when it was sunk. And they went into the water together and stayed together the entire time. And he says that my grandfather lived until the third night, and he was with him when he died. And he said that he helped him as long as he could, even though he was very weak himself. But one of the things that always stands out to me in this letter is that my grandfather told Mr. Polk that if he didn't make it, he asked him to write my grandmother a letter and to tell her that he wasn't too good to die for his country, and that he loved her with all his heart, and would see her again one day where there's no parting. And that's a treasure to me. So we don't know the whereabouts, but we do know the sort of the when. And anyway.
Anybody else have anything to share on that score?
May I say
Yes.
one more thing real quick, Doctor?
Yes.
Okay. The Navy has done a wonderful job recognizing the 75th anniversary, just so you know. I mean, they had a moment of silence, and PJ was interviewed for an article. So the United States Navy understands the history and the legacy of the ship. So sorry, Doctor.
Great. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, I was just going to say, I think I had referenced before that there were other members of the family after Albert that served, but in particular, his twin, my father was 13 when the ship went down. His twin approached it very differently. She never really spoke with her children too much about her brother, though she went on through life. And so some years later, two of her sons entered the military during the Vietnam era. And my cousin who entered the Navy and who eerily looks strikingly like my Uncle Bud just didn't tell her he came home in his Navy uniform. And my aunt, he told me that my aunt just saw him and just burst out crying and put her arms around him. And that was all that was said after that. But that generation, there were several. And then the generation after me, there was one member that was admitted to West Point. So in spite of what has happened, there continues an interest and a desire to serve.
It's a lot, and it's very meaningful that we as the future generations respect and honor their service in this way. The ship was found in August of 2017, 3 years ago. Do any of you want to share your thoughts about that?
I'll just go ahead and say quickly, that was the first time that I felt very uncomfortable. And I wasn't sure whether or not I really even wanted to watch anything. And I hadn't felt like that. I didn't read, my father had showed us Abandoned Ship. I couldn't get through reading it, but I just remember being afraid for my father and not sure that I wanted to tell him because I wasn't sure how he would respond. He was fine, obviously, but that's how I felt.
Judy, I saw you raise your hand.
When I got the call from one of Don McCall's sons that day that he found out that they found the Indianapolis. I just gave a sigh and thought it brought closure. But yet I thought maybe they'll find some dog tags that has my dad's name on it. Of course, it's going to be a memorial for the crew, which is fine, but I was happy that it was found.
Anybody else want to share their thoughts? Paul?
I would say that my aunt died in 2016. She wouldn't know. And again, my mom, again, is very different, very quiet. We're not going to talk about personally. I did feel my stomach was at ease. I did get a really sick feeling because knowing that he would have been down there, of course, 60, not 70 years later, no, but just his spirit. And I did get a little sick. I have to admit, it was uneasy, but I'm glad they did find it though.
Keith?
I was really glad they found it. I saw that early that morning when it was announced, and I don't know, I looked at it and I just cried, you know, and I guess y'all figured out I'm a big baby, but I just cried, and I was just amazed. And I looked at those pictures, and then, you know, later, it was a good bit later that we saw even more pictures, and it was just amazing to me to look and to see the guns and to wonder which of those that my grandfather was standing watch on it was hit, you know, just amazed. Wish my grandmother could have lived just a little longer to see that.
To see that. It's amazing what condition the ship was in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was really special that they found the ship. And when you think that it is a burial site, you know, for so many of the men. And like I said, we always thought that my uncle went down with the ship, but then, you know, when we knew that his body was recovered, that was kind of a special thing. But like I said, we found that out in 2008, and my dad didn't actually pass away till 13. But I think I shared with Jane that I never wanted to tell my dad that his brother's body was recovered, because I think that would have kind of hurt him, you know, because if he thought he went down with the ship, then that would have been kind of more of a sudden death, where the fact that his body was recovered, he almost survived it, you know. And so that it was just kind of, yeah.
So it's interesting to me that all of you have found your way to feeling connected to the story and part of the bigger and growing USS Indianapolis family. I mean, for every 1,195 men that were on that crew, now we have 2, 3, 4 generations represented. So it multiplies and multiplies. My dad used to say to me, if you save a life, you're responsible for that life. So we did the math on just the 316. I can't even imagine how many stories there are for the 1,195 total and the 897 crewmen who did not come home. Can you share, any of you, can you share what that means to feel connected to something bigger than just your own family, that you are part of a bigger family here now? Jeanette? You?
I think that it is something to know that you're not connected to just a lesson in a history book. That's so meaningful to me, that for these other individuals, it's a real story. It's really part of their life. I had never come across anyone. My father had gone to reunions in the past, and he has taken us back to the memorial in Indianapolis. But to actually interact with other individuals, it just gives you a sense of kinship. It's kind of like, instead of meeting a good friend, meeting a family member. That's what it means.
Anybody else want to add to that? Okay. So last call for any other additional comments.
I just want to say I am so touched by everyone else's passion, if I can say everyone else's passion for the story, because the story is not a passion for our family. It's not there. It's a dark time for the family, and it lived on. So when I see how excited people like Sarah Vladeck is, and she loves the story, and I should love the story, and I do love the story. But on the other hand, I understand the pain that those two ladies carried with them forever. And I, not to rain on anybody's parade, but, and I'm glad that PJ got to carry on the legacy of his great grandfather. And I definitely, I have a connection to the military because I've had students, being a high school band director, I've had students go to the military. They're interested in the story. So I have shared the story with my classes, telling them that, you know, all these men, most of the men were your age. They were like 18, 17 years old. What are you doing? No, but so I definitely do feel a different feeling when everybody else is so passionate in a positive way, going to the reunions. I've never gone to another reunion. It just hasn't happened. So I'm the odd duck out. I'm glad I'm here because I definitely think the executive officer's legacy should be part of the ship. He's the one that calls the abandoned ship call. And I definitely have, I'm touched by people's stories about him and how special he was. And one last thing, it's interesting to feel connection because when I hear the stories about him being a smart aleck, I am too. So it's really cool to see that connection. But I do appreciate everything, Jane and Sarah. It's been a great experience. So thank you.
Oh, well, you're welcome. But you have had to walk that balance in life, you know, of having, you know, not wanting to disappoint and knowing where the boundaries are, but then trying to find a way to support your son and his choices too. Well, as you can see, for every one of the 897 men that were lost at sea, there's a story of an individual, somebody's husband, somebody's father, somebody's son, somebody's brother, somebody's uncle, somebody's cousin. And the impact of their service and that ultimate sacrifice is felt through each generation. So I would like to thank you, folks, our panelists, for sharing with us today and for being part of this ever-expanding Indy family. And I'd also like to thank the viewers for tuning in. If you have any additional questions that you would like to pose, I urge you to connect with us through our Facebook page or on the website, which is ussindianapolis.com. And we certainly appreciate your interest in helping us keep this story alive. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.